and I'm able to bike around the block. My kids are crying, my wife is crying, I'm crying, because this feels so miraculous. Because when you have progressive multiple sclerosis, you sort of accept that, and you're told time and time again by all of your treating physicians that there is nothing that we can do to restore your functions, that once they're gone forever. And I just biked. It changes how I think about disease and health. It changes the way I practice medicine.
Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. What is up, you guys? I am so excited. My book, The Carnivore Code, is going to be released on February 25th. It is currently on Amazon. You can go to thecarnivorecodebook.com to see the page there. The print book will be available on the 25th. The ebook is available for pre-order. I am currently recording the audiobook right now. It will be done by the time this podcast comes out, and I am hoping the audiobook will also be available on February 25th. Mark your calendars. 2 weeks from today, the whole shebang drops, and I'm super stoked about all of that. Thank you to everyone who pre-ordered. Those books will probably ship this week, and I imagine you will have those books days before anyone else, and I would love to hear what you think. Send me your feedback, tag me on Instagram, and I will repost all of that because this is a very exciting time, you guys. Super exciting. If you like this podcast, please leave me a review on iTunes. We have over 500 reviews in less than a year. Every week, this podcast is top 10 in health and medicine. It is so exciting. I just feel so grateful that I can bring value to you guys. Please let me know how I can continue to do that. My website is carnivoremd.com. You can sign up for the newsletter there, which is the Fundamental Health Insider. That came out this week. All right, my guest is none other than Terry Wahls. She is an amazing individual who originally did her residency in internal medicine. She is a certified functional medicine practitioner and has actually received the Institute for Functional Medicine's Linus Pauling Award for her contributions to research, clinical care, and patient advocacy. She had a pretty darn severe autoimmune disease. She had progressive multiple sclerosis, was in a wheelchair for many years, and has been able to reverse that for the most part in herself with dietary change. And as you will hear in this podcast, she feels that a lot of her autoimmune disease may have been due to a low-fat vegetarian diet. So we dig into all of that. We dig into the microbiome. We dig into what things she made, what changes she made in her diet that improved her health. We kind of get into those details there. And then we wrap a little bit about the carnivore diet, her concerns. We kind of have a little counterpoint. It's a super friendly, fun conversation. And I really appreciate the work that Dr. Wahls is doing. I'm so grateful that she came onto the show this week. And at the end of the podcast, you will hear that she and I are conspiring, we are scheming about some future carnivore studies, which really need to be done because I think both she and I are so interested in autoimmune disease and how we reverse this and the potential applications of a carnivore diet for this set of illnesses. So super exciting stuff, you guys. Other exciting stuff is the work that my brethren, my people at Belcampo and White Oak Pastures are doing in regenerative agriculture. I'm hoping to do a lot more podcasts on this soon. Specifically, Belcampo is a farm in Northern California. It's in Waireka, and they are doing rotational grazing, regenerative agriculture, grass feeding, grass finishing. They have been shown to be putting more organic matter into the soil, putting carbon into the soil. They are life cycle negative in terms of carbon when these analyses have been done. You can find them at belcampo.com. They have an online store and some of the best meat I have ever eaten. It is certified organic, regenerative, carbon negative, carbon increasing, organic matter increasing in the soil. And for listeners of this podcast, they are offering a special deal. You can use the code CarnivoreMD to get 20% off of all their stuff till the end of the month. They also have liver, which is something that all my peeps are always looking for. They have thymus as well, and they have heart. We're trying to get more organ meats, and in the future, I'm super excited about bringing them into the fold with an organ grind. But you should check out the bone and ribeye steak, the tri-tip is amazing. Seriously, this meat is fantastic, and these organs are some of the most pristine I've ever had. You can also check out their restaurants, which are in New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And if you do that, I would recommend the cowboy ribeye. It's 2 pounds, and it is phenomenal. You all know that I believe strongly that regenerative agriculture is the incontrovertible argument for using ruminant animals on this planet in a sustainable way, and I could not be more happy, excited, proud to support farms like Belcampo. So check them out. Check out what they are doing. Try their meat. Let me know what you think, because it is so good, and we vote with our dollars. Nourish yourselves, nourish your planet, nourish your family. You guys, this is how we thrive. This is how future generations of humans remain on this planet, is by returning to these sort of rotational grassland ecosystems that are mirroring what buffalo used to do on this planet. So check out belcampo.com, BELCAMPO. Use the code CarnivoreMD for 20% off. The other super exciting thing is that White Oak Pastures continues to crush it as well. They are in Georgia. You guys know about them if you've listened to this podcast before. 6th generation, 150 years in the family, that farm. In the last 20 years, they've been doing regenerative agriculture because Will Harris, the owner, is an amazing individual, very aware, very foresighted, very progressive in his thinking, and they have been able to increase the amount of organic matter in their soil from 0.5 to 5%. When you come to White Oak Cella in May, which is May 1st to 3rd, you can find this on the White Oak website under events. I want to see you guys all there. It is a celebration of regenerative agriculture. We are going to be throwing axes, having bonfires, eating amazing meat, spending time in community, looking at this progressive, really groundbreaking farm. You will see the difference between the dirt on Will's farm and the dirt on his neighbor's farm. It is such a profound, striking contrast. And this is the nutrients that goes into the animals, both here at White Oak, at Belcampo, in all of the farms across the country, many of whom I still want to support, and I'm hoping I can get to and visit, who are doing this type of agriculture. You can find them at whiteoakpastures.com. You can use the code CarnivoreMD for 10% off your first order, or you can go to info.whiteoakpastures.com/carnivoremd for my landing page for all the listeners of this podcast, and you can find out what is on special this month. Every month there are 15% items there on that webpage, and you can use the code CARNIVORE15 there. I hope that you will all join us at White Oak Cella, May 1st to 3rd at that farm, and I am just so proud to be supporting White Oak Pastures, Belcampo, and hopefully many more of these regenerative farms. This is the message that we need to get out, you guys. This is what I believe in so deeply. Because when you walk on these farms and you see what is happening with these animals, you will never again be led astray or confused by all of the political, the psychological rhetoric from plant-based advocates who are claiming that ruminants are hurting the planet. You can clearly see that the earth is thriving in these places. The dirt is so brown, the grass is so green, and the people are beautiful, and the animals are healthy. This is the way we do it, you guys. This is the way we move forward. Belcampo.com, whiteoakpastures.com, CarnivoreMD at both of those places will get you some serious discounts. Let me know what you think. Tag me. Nourish yourselves and your families in the deepest way. The other way that I think we can all nourish ourselves and our families is by eating more organ meats. You guys know that I love this. I talk about this with Terry Wahls in this podcast. Getting organ meats is so crucial, but sometimes it's difficult if we're traveling, if we don't have access to these things, or there are organs that we can't get or that we are not necessarily super excited about eating, and this is where Ancestral Supplements comes in. Ancestralsupplements.com, they are creating grass-fed, grass-finished organ complex supplements that are freeze-dried to preserve all the nutrients in a gelatin capsule. It makes it so convenient to eat. And as Dr. Wahls talks about in this podcast, she takes these. She takes desiccated organ supplements when she goes traveling. She knows the value of liver, and she can't always get it when she's traveling and doing stuff. And so when she's home, she eats liver and other organs. When she's traveling, she uses these organ complex supplements and really finds benefit with them. I will let you guys know that there are two exciting things that Ancestral Supplements has had recently happen. They have a new supplement, the Male Optimization Formula, the MOFO. And this one is made from testicle and prostate and liver. And I am fascinated by this one. You guys know that I am interested in eating testicles and just eating nose to tail in general. Try that one if you are interested in male optimization. The other thing that's that's exciting is they now have intestines back in stock. Intestines were one of their best-selling supplements, probably because when we freeze-dry the intestines of animals, there are all sorts of good growth factors in there that can benefit humans who have issues with their gut. There are some amazing testimonials for all of their supplements, but look at the intestine supplements, guys. This is amazing. So check out intestines, check out Mofo from Ancestral Supplements. You can use the code SALADINOMD at their Shopify site for 10% off. They are putting back in what the modern world has left out. And as we know, the modern world has left out many, many things. The last sponsor of this podcast is Native Deodorant. You can find them at nativedeodorant.com. They are creating simple, effective, clean products that we use to not smell like caveman every day. They have over 8,000 five-star reviews from their customers. They are formulated without aluminum, parabens, and talc. They use natural ingredients such as coconut oil, shea butter, tapioca starch. They don't do any animal testing, and they have free shipping and returns. You know what? Natural deodorant works, especially from Native, and it can provide us with an amazing alternative than putting things that are xenoestrogens in our armpits, which are certainly going to get absorbed, and we don't want that. They have coconut and vanilla, which is the most popular scent, lavender and rose, cucumber and mint, eucalyptus and mint, all kinds of great stuff there. I use this stuff, guys. It keeps me from smelling like a caveman, and that is amazing. So I think you guys should think about what is going into your armpits. You should not be using things that have xenoestrogens, things like that have parabens, all these other kind of things. Native Deodorant is a great option here. Check them out. You can get 20% off your first purchase if you visit nativedeodorant.com and use the promo code SALADINO at checkout. And again, they have free shipping and returns. Don't want to smell like a caveman, but you want to live like a caveman or a cavewoman, and you want to kick butt like a caveman or a cavewoman. So check out nativedeodorant.com. On to the podcast. I appreciate you all. Listen after for what's going on with me. All right, we are live. Dr. Terry Wahls, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Before the podcast, we were rapping a little bit about the carnivore diet and ketosis, so we're going to get into all kinds of cool stuff. But I just want to let people know who are listening to this on audio that there's a video that's associated with us with this on YouTube, and behind Terry is a bookshelf with multiple copies of her book, The Wahls Protocol, which is going to be re-released in March 17th, the new and updated version. And I see 5 poop emojis.
Yes, I have even more that are sort of hidden behind my head. We have many, many poop emojis. People know I love that. So I get poop soap, poop squeezies, poop pillows, poop hats. I have even more poop in my office at the university as well.
So, and I've heard you talk about this in your presentations, your PowerPoint presentations, make a snake, make a good poop. One of the things that's so interesting for me is that, and we'll probably get into this in the podcast, that on a carnivore diet, what I've observed is that a lot of people's GI stuff gets much better, and that we can make good poops with or without fiber. So we'll probably get into that. But tell me about your predilection for the poop emoji and why this is so central for you.
Well, I think we know that you and I have about 25,000 genes that we got from mom and dad. And we got 5 million to 10 million genes from our mom's microbiome. And that over the millions of generations, when a spontaneous mutation occurs, that one of our ancestral mothers couldn't make compound XYZ, but her bacteria could. So at that moment, her genome got simplified, and an important process got exported from her genome to her microbiome genome. And so over millions and millions of generations and these random mutations, our DNA has been simplified, and we rely on our bacteria to do many of these processes that are important to optimal health. And so my interpretation of the research is that we seem to have a very clear identification that our hunter-gatherers have different microbiome than we have. That's far more rich, far more diverse, and actually includes many microbes that we think of as pathogens. So it's a community of microbes that sustain us. And so this is to remind me and remind my patients and my public followers that we're all an ecosystem. And the better stewards we are of our ecosystem, the more likely we are to have a healthy microbiome that can do all of the processes that are necessary and required for optimal health. So, and I think we need to monitor that, but not with fancy lab tests. It's with simply standing up and looking at your poop and assessing the quality of your poop. That gives you immense feedback. Are you the way that is more aligned with health or more aligned with disease processes?
Yeah, I think that we agree on that concept. It'll be interesting to dig into that a little more and see if we have disparate views on how to cultivate or how to achieve that or how to curate the microbiome. I think that there is so much discussion about the microbiome now. And one of the things I talked about on a recent podcast with Chris Kresser was what I believe to be a premature and false notion that we absolutely need plant fiber to curate a diverse microbiome. So many of the studies that we see that suggest that that's the case are epidemiology. They're observational epidemiology, comparing kids in Burkina Faso to urban Italian children. And if we look at the interventional studies with fiber or the removal of fiber, we don't really see a change in the alpha diversity. And I love that you brought this up. We definitely do see that ancestral peoples have a much more diverse microbiome. And as I talked about on that podcast and a few others, we know that a diverse microbiome is not in and of itself indicative of a, quote, healthy microbiome, because we can have lots of proteobacteria or other gram-negative aerobic organisms that can be pathogenic, that are causing it to look like there's diversity, but there's not really a good collection of organisms.
The real need that we have is we have all these processes that must occur for optimal health. And so when people are getting fired up and excited about their microbiome reports, I sort of chuckle because my scientific colleagues who are part of my research team and I debate what is the optimal microbiome. And we admit that the species are probably not that important. It's the processes that the microbiome can do. And so what we really would want to be following is the metabolome. What are the processes that are happening in our bloodstream? And do we have the microbiome that supports all those processes? And that's a very young science. That's an incredibly young science. And right now we're writing multiple grants every cycle to get funding to analyze my freezer and analyze the microbiome from the blood specimens and the urine specimens and the poop specimens that we have from all of my clinical trials. So we can see what are the processes that are changing in the people that don't get well and the processes that are changing in the people that do get well.
What are some of these metabolic processes or processes that you feel like the microbiome needs to be doing for us? So what are some of the markers you're looking for in the metabolome to give you clinical endpoints here?
Well, the reality is we don't know. The metabolome, the companies that we're talking to will do 20,000 different metabolites, some of which are named, about half of which are named and half of which are not named but keep showing up. And so they just have a numeric value. This is a really young science. Now, if you look at functional medicine, we have a variety of metabolites that we look at for fatty acids, for the Krebs cycle, for dysbiosis, for fatty acids, vitamin markers. They're helpful, and the functional medicine docs use those and give people various supplements to try and optimize those. But I think you and I would say that, well, that's helpful, but it's incomplete. What really is aligned with optimal health is when we figure out what is the diet and lifestyle that you eat and perform and live, and you'll grow the right microbiome to support the right processes. This is an early science. A lot of my functional medicine colleagues use these tests, a lot of supplements to try and get there. I think you and I would agree that if we can look at this through the ancestral health lens and think about what is the diet and lifestyle that will get you there. Because when I look at the research, the epidemiology says these nutrients are really helpful. And so then we clinical scientists decide, like, okay, I'm going to test this in how I know how to test it. Singular molecular pathway. I'll use one nutrient that I'm going to add or subtract and see the impact. And what nearly always is, when you do it one nutrient at a time, or even just 2 or 3, the impact is not there.
Exactly.
This doesn't seem to change clinical outcomes, because diet and lifestyle is incredibly complex. So I think assessing food patterns is where we get the answer, not assessing single nutrients.
I totally agree with that. And I think that the myopic reductionist view fails repeatedly. And I'm not a fan of excessive or even focused use of supplementation in my practice, nor do I think that it serves the patient, nor do I think that it recapitulates evolutionary progress or ancestral lens. So I love what you're saying there about ancestral themes. And I think it's so interesting to think about the way that we might have eaten. Again, it's conjecture, right? And it's challenging. But I think it's so interesting to think about the way that we might have eaten and to look at that mirrored in ancestral peoples or indigenous peoples who are currently living. And the notion that indigenous peoples have a more diverse microbiome, a lot of people will say this is due to fiber. And I debate that openly, saying, you know what? Because when we give people fiber, we don't see alpha diversity increase. I suspect that the alpha diversity that's higher in indigenous peoples has to do with dirt and touching animals and butchering animals and being in the sun and all of these other ancestral lifestyle practices that affect the microbiome in ways that we haven't even begun to assess. There was a study that I posted on my Instagram a few weeks ago. I believe it was observational epidemiology, but there is a correlation between sunlight exposure and more diversity in your microbiome. Now, is that reflecting people being outside and being exposed to microbes outside? Is it something that has to do with the ultraviolet light on our skin that is making vitamin D or cholesterol sulfate or endorphins or nitric oxide or other compounds that we don't even know about? But it's just such an interesting idea, because even within the functional medicine sphere, I'm disappointed at the reductionist view that people are trying to take. And they're really trying, and even within discussions of the microbiome, people are trying to say, we know what the most healthy microbiome is. And as you suggested, at a species level, we just don't, right?
We absolutely don't, because even at a species level, we have to remember the microbes are swapping genes all the time. So it doesn't mean that that microbe can do the processes that my body needs.
Right.
My team is actually working on developing a new index to look at these big data sets with actually several new indexes. One of them, of course, is how Wahls' diet is that food pattern. So that'll be a fun index to look at these big data sets with. But we're also developing a processed foods index, because when I look at these epidemiology studies, in some of these intervention studies, that diets that have been shown prospectively to be helpful, the Mediterranean diet, the paleo diet, some of these, the MIND diet, what these are looking at basically is a reduction of processed foods. And so the dietitian who's also a PhD, is a member of my study team, he and I had these conversations that we think that the common thread is that you're reducing sugar, you're reducing these high glycemic index grains diets. And the more we get those modern foods out of our diet, the healthier the individual is. So that'll be, when we get that constructed, that's going to be a very fun type of analysis to see what the correlation is between processed foods and health outcomes. And you and I, we can have some hypotheses that'll be fun to test, that the more processed food, the poorer the clinical outcomes will be.
Oh, for sure.
So that'll be fun. And of course, we predict that the more Paleolithic like your diet is, or Mediterranean like, the healthier the outcomes. The more Wahls like, the healthier the outcomes. I certainly agree with you. It's been a struggle with the functional medicine community and their emphasis on testing and supplements. One of the beauties of my early functional medicine exposure was that my clinical practice was in the VA, in the Veterans Affairs Hospital. So there was no advanced testing, and there were no fancy supplements. You could get fish oil, B vitamins, and a multivite. and that was it. Eventually we got, so we could get Saccharomyces boulardii, but you know, that's my toolkit. So what did I have? I had education about diet, lifestyle, and inspiration. And we had, ultimately, I was allowed to create a lifestyle clinic where I could practice exactly how I wanted. And I had amazing transformations, stunning success, without fancy testing, without fancy labs, with inspiration, story, possibility, group supports. And my toolkit was changing the diet, getting outside, putting on a step counter, moving more, having more meaning to your life. And we had stunning success. So, you know, I've been pushing in the A4M community and the IFM community to be a lecturer there, and to stress that you can have stunning success with an ancestral health toolkit.
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely. I mean, that's probably in my opinion, that's the reason, quote, functional medicine works. And to be honest with you, I've gone through a process of repeatedly losing my religion, right? This is an REM song from my childhood.
Yes.
And so, you know, I was classically trained as an MD. I kind of lost my religion there, thinking, the symptom-focused pharmaceutical-based model doesn't work. I found functional medicine, and then I had to lose my functional medicine religion, thinking this overly supplement-based focus, this overly testing-based focus doesn't really work. And where I've also landed is sort of thinking about these ancestral ideas and kind of pulling back. And like you're saying, I think we can achieve so much for people without super fancy testing, without a ton of supplements, with just basic things. We'll talk more about the carnivore diet later in this podcast. I do think that there are some people who need a little bit more detail and go beyond those things. And there are specific dietary interventions that we need to think about. But I just want to stress for the listener that we are totally agreeing that at a basic level, we don't necessarily need a gut test to tell her that our microbiome is healthy. If we don't have gas, bloating, pain, constipation, bleeding with stool, need to use laxatives, and we can stand up from taking a poop and look at it, and it's a healthy poop, people will know what this is, then that's probably a pretty good indicator that things are going well in our gut. Would you agree with that?
You know, and the other thing I would agree with, and again, this is my microbiome immunology colleague who's part of my team, and his expertise is the microbiome. He would agree that we don't have a lab test that tells you you've got a healthy microbiome. That looking at your poop, can you poop easily and comfortably without pooping in your pants? If you can achieve that, you have as healthy a microbiome as we can understand. That I don't have a test that would give me any more guidance than you're just looking at your poop.
Yeah. And so the flip side of that is, what if people don't have that, right? I work with a lot of people who have chronic constipation, chronic diarrhea, pain, bleeding, things like that. I think the real question becomes, how do we fix it if it looks broken? So I would love for you to, give us your perspective on that. Tell us a little more about the Wahls diet, and maybe a little more about your story and how you arrived at that. And then I'll maybe offer some perspective as well.
Why don't we start with my story? Because I think that's compelling. I am a conventionally trained internal medicine doc at a university with very conventional approaches to complementary alternative medicine, functional medicine, deeply skeptical. I'm diagnosed with MS in 2000 on the basis of lesions in my spinal cord and one lesion in my brain, MRI, spinal tap, all that stuff. I want to treat my disease aggressively, so I seek out the best MS center in the country. I see their best people, take the newest drugs, and go steadily downhill. Now, fortunately, I'm told about the work of Lauren Cordain. 2 years into my diagnosis, I read his books, his papers, and after 20 years of having been a low-fat vegetarian, I decided to embrace being a paleo eater. I give up all grain, all dairy, all legumes, and embrace the paleo diet. I continue to go downhill. I'm in a tilt-recline wheelchair. I start reading the basic science. I'm experimenting on supplements, focused on the mitochondria and on brain cell health. And I figure out that my supplements help my fatigue a little bit, and they slow the speed of my decline. So I'm thrilled. In '07, I discovered the Institute for Functional Medicine. I take their course in neuroprotection. I have a longer list of supplements, but I'm excited that they're so focused on mitochondria and biochemistry. And at the summer of '07, I'm so weak I cannot sit up in a regular chair. I'm beginning to have trouble with brain fog. And I've had 27 years of worsening trigeminal neuralgia, those electrical face pains. They're more frequent, more severe, much more difficult to turn off. And I'm told I'm going to be transferred to the traumatic brain injury clinic in 6 months. And the job's described to me, and I know it's a job I cannot do physically. But, I've discovered functional medicine. I'm sort of integrating my thinking on ancestral health, the basic science I'm reading, functional medicine. And then I have a really big aha moment. Like, what if I redesign my diet in a very specific way to get my nutrients? And so I now have a much more structured Paleolithic diet. And I start that at December 26, 2007. And in January, I go off to this new clinic and I just observe what people are doing for a week. And then I start seeing these patients. And I'm going in my tilt recline wheelchair. I'm standing up, doing exams, sitting down, making my notes. And I realized at the end of the week, like, oh my God, I actually could do it. And it's startling. I realize I'm having more energy. My thinking is more clear. And then I realize my pain, my face pain is gone. And I start getting stronger. My physical therapist tells me that, yes, you're getting stronger. He advances my exercises. I begin weightlifting. I begin walking again in the hospital. People are stunned. Every time they see me, they're like, oh my God, Dr. Wahls, you're walking. And then 6 months into this, I talked to my family that I want to try riding my bike. And it's actually Mother's Day on 2008. We ride. My son is going to jog on the left. My daughter is going to jog on the right. My wife is following on her bike. And I'm able to bike around the block. My kids are crying. My wife is crying. I'm crying. Because this feels so miraculous, because when you have progressive multiple sclerosis, you sort of accept that, and you're told time and time again by all of your treating physicians that there is nothing that we can do to restore your functions, that once they are gone forever. And I just biked. So it changes how I think about disease and health. It changes the way I practice medicine. It ultimately changes the way I do research. And 6 months later, I do an 18.5 mile bike ride with my family.
It's amazing.
So, and it's so clear that the current conventional understanding of neurodegeneration, of progressive MS, of relapsing remitting MS is incomplete. And then when I start practicing this way in my traumatic brain injury clinic, before when I got there, my partners would tell the TBI folks that, well, if you have too much rage, we'll give you antipsychotics. Otherwise, we'll just sort of wait and see what happens. And I come in and say, there's a whole lot we can do, folks. We can do your diet, your lifestyle, and you can repair and regrow your brain tissue. So it became very clear who I had seen in the traumatic brain injury clinic, because they got better. It was quite dramatic. And then in the primary care clinic, the people that I saw, I'm talking about diet and lifestyle, and teaching the residents how to do this and how to get patients inspired and hopeful and willing to go on this journey. And so people are losing weight, blood sugars are normalizing, pain is resolving, rheumatoid arthritis, systemic lupus, fibromyalgia, type 2 diabetes, anxiety, depression. And after 2 years of this, the chief of medicine pulls me in and says, we got to take you out of primary care. We want you to have your own clinic. And so then we established the therapeutic lifestyle clinic. Over the next 3 years, we have we see the sickest folks from the pain clinic, from primary care. And again, I'm not doing fancy functional medicine testing. I'm not doing fancy functional medicine labs. I'm doing diet and lifestyle. And we have stunning success. So
it's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that story.
yeah.
And I think that there are so many pieces of that I want to highlight, but I'll start with highlighting the notion that Western medicine believes that autoimmune disease of all shapes and sizes is untreatable. And I want the listener to know that that is false. And so anyone listening to this podcast can look at my story, the work I do, your story, the work you've done, and the incredible contributions of many others in the space, which argue strongly against the fact that autoimmune disease is an unchangeable diagnosis. Autoimmune disease is not something that we cannot modify. And we see this with the carnivore diet.
Yeah.
We see it with the Wahls diet. And this is what is so exciting to me. And people who know my story will know that the reason I got interested in the carnivore diet was because of my own autoimmune issues and my own sort of fascination and obsession with understanding what is causing autoimmune disease. One of the things that I've heard you say that I completely agree with, and I have arrived at pretty much the same conclusion, is that so much of the chronic disease that we see in humans today is autoimmune.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
Chronic inflammation and autoimmunity are essentially synonyms.
Yes.
And I'm formally trained in psychiatry, did my residency at the University of Washington. And it is not common practice within psychiatry to imagine that psychiatric illness is autoimmune. But we know this is the case. And I've talked about this. We won't go down this rabbit hole today. There's so much brain inflammation and brain autoimmunity with depression, anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia. It's all so similar. All of the diseases we see have so many commonalities. And my story, your story highlight that the biggest lever that we have here is diet and lifestyle. And that's really what this podcast is all about. And so again, for the listener, autoimmune disease is fixable. It's totally fixable. And so if you have multiple sclerosis, if you have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, if you have rheumatoid arthritis, if you have psoriasis, eczema like I did, depression, anxiety, these are autoimmune diseases that are malleable with diet and lifestyle. And so the other thing I want to highlight is that you developed MS after, I believe you said 20 years of a low-fat vegetarian diet.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
So many of the clients that I see who have autoimmune disease will go to practitioners and are told, avoid meat, go on a plant-based diet.
Yeah,
but I just want to highlight, and I don't know that it's, as a carnivore, as someone that advocates for a carnivore diet.
Yeah. I think they were connected. Absolutely. I
interesting. And as someone that advocates for a carnivore diet, part of the hypotheses that I advance is that plants can trigger autoimmunity. So how interesting is it that a low-fat vegetarian diet, which is something that is very in vogue these days and many physicians would advocate for, both you and I believe was connected with the development of your autoimmune syndrome. That's fascinating.
I think it was. And part of it, as I've more recently have been reading a lot more evolutionary biology, and so I'm now thinking about evolutionary principles as I'm modifying my recommendations and as I'm teaching the public and teaching clinicians the interventions that I use. And I want them to understand evolutionary biology as we evaluate, because whatever you and I know today, we always have to keep evaluating that in terms of the additional science, additional observations. And I want us to think about it in terms of the evolutionary principles. What does evolution suggest? What do our ancestral mothers and fathers suggest? And the more that I can emulate what I think my ancestral mothers and fathers were doing within the context of today's environment, I think that's the first recommendation that I'll have for folks. And then I may modify that to make incremental steps that are achievable for the patients that I'm serving.
And so there's another piece of your story that I want to highlight and dig into here that I think will be illuminating. In 2007, you went on to what you described as a Paleolithic diet. You read Lauren Cordain.
Actually, it was 2002. I did the Cordain diet.
Right.
And, I love the paleo diet.
Right.
But I have to remind everyone that was not enough to recover me.
Exactly.
And I love functional medicine. That was not enough to recover me. I had to integrate all of that and sort of redesign it in a more synergistic way with the ancestral health principles. And that led to this dramatic change.
And that's super fascinating. I'm having Lauren Cordain on my podcast. We're going to be talking about sort of the nuances of how he developed that approach. But let's just dig into this a little bit more. So you did a Paleolithic diet in 2002, and most listeners will be familiar with what a Paleolithic diet was.
Yeah, basically I did the AIP.
So you did an autoimmune paleo diet, which I'd love to hear what you were doing. And then let's really try and understand at a detailed level, what did you change that you think made the difference? Because that is a very valuable clinical observation, So you were doing autoimmune paleo, which is no nuts, no grains, no seeds, no legumes, no dairy. And then that wasn't enough to help. Is that right?
It was not enough to help. And I was doing supplements for my mitochondria. And that I did for 6 months into this, and then I thought, I'm wasting my money, and I quit.
Which supplements were you taking for the mitochondria?
So B complex, carnitine, creatine, CoQ, and that's already on fish oil.
Right.
So I thought, I'm wasting my money, so I stopped everything, couldn't get out of bed, and after 3 days, my wife came back and said, honey, I think you ought to try these again. And I took them and felt better the next day. And I thought, wow, that was really interesting. So I repeated my experiments in 2 weeks. Of course, it was open label, but still, I was exhausted for 3 days, couldn't get out of bed. And so now I am pumped. Like, oh my God, I'm learning stuff that my neurologist and primary care doc aren't telling me about. So I'm much more fired up about reading basic science and sort of tinkering with supplements after that.
I'll just mention that those supplements you were taking, CoQ10, carnitine,
creatine.
What were the other ones? Creatine. These are meat, right? That's basically meat, right? That's meat. And I talk about this in my book, carnitine, choline, carnosine, CoQ10, creatine. These are all unique nutrients only found in appreciable quantities in animal foods. Okay. So the AIP diet wasn't working. What were the changes there?
It's sort of interesting. What I ended up doing was pulling back on the meat somewhat. I also was much more meticulous that I was only getting organic foods.
Oh, interesting.
I added liver. You'll like that one.
Oh, yeah. I love that. You added liver. I love that.
I added liver. I was much more into mussels, oysters, clams. So I'm getting shellfish. And then on the vegetable sides, I'm much more specific to greens, a big amount of greens every day. And that's probably having 6 cups of greens a day. I'm also adding many more things out of the garlic family, in the cabbage family, and mushrooms. I'm really digging into the mushrooms.
Which mushrooms?
And I was going for a variety. We had a variety of dried mushrooms and fresh mushrooms, and shiitake, the white button mushrooms, the crimini mushrooms as well, miyatakes. So whatever mushrooms we had available in the store, because I was like, okay, my goal is 200 different plant species in a year. So I was really into maximizing diversity. Now, what is stunning, so what it really ramped up in a dramatic way, though, is the greens.
Which greens?
And so lots of kale, collards, parsley, cilantro, mixed lettuce greens, chard, not quite as often. And then, what's really interesting, when I was recovering enough to travel, I remember that next year, I'm recovered enough to travel to present some of our papers, and I couldn't take the volume of greens that I was used to. My energy plummeted about 36 hours into the trip. So I'm calling back to my wife saying, okay, I have a huge kale salad for me. So she had a bread bowl filled with my massaged kale salad. And I got home and I ate that whole thing in one sitting immediately. So now in retrospect, probably what I think there's a lot more evidence that vitamin K2, MK4 is vitally important for brain function. And that early on in my recovery, my brain must be just sucking in huge amounts of the carotenoids. Yes, but I bet the vitamin K2 is vital.
But there's
And
no vitamin
so
K2 in kale.
there isn't, but your bacteria can make it, and then your liver can process it further.
Interesting. I wonder what would have happened if you'd increased the liver. Are you familiar with the Rotterdam
Well,
trial?
yes. Well, the challenge with the increase, so I was having liver once a week.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge with liver, or the risk with liver, is vitamin A. Because there is a low vitamin A, terrible, particularly for autoimmunity, which clearly I have a pretty bad case. And then, a fairly moderate blood level, or part of the U-shaped curve where your vitamin A intake is good for you. But if you become toxic in vitamin A, then you develop pulmonary fibrosis, cirrhosis, and you're really screwed because the retinol levels, you can't get them out.
Right. At what level do you think that happens, though? My impression is that that's not going to happen with reasonable amounts of liver.
Because your SNPs are will determine how efficiently you're utilizing and metabolizing your carotenoids to retinol and absorbing the retinol from the liver that you're eating. Mm-hmm. There's some variation there. My recommendation is 6 ounces of liver every week, and I'm probably between 6 to 8 ounces routinely myself.
Right.
There are some ways of monitoring that with your retinol esters in terms of toxicity levels. And so this is one of the recommendations I would give you for the carnivore diet, is to find a way to monitor your retinol levels so you don't inadvertently overshoot. I think that's one of the potential hazards for the carnivore diet, is to overshoot the retinol and end up with the pulmonary fibrosis and cirrhosis.
Yeah, I think that that's something we need to research much more, because I think that a food like liver that has been prized by our ancestors throughout evolution is unlikely to be causing any significant human toxicity at reasonable doses. Of course, eating polar bear liver with, that has 100 times more concentration of vitamin A may be problematic, or there's potentially those polar bear livers were contaminated with cadmium. I don't think we really know, but the vitamin A question is quite interesting.
I mean, I think the vitamin A is an important question, and having a way of monitoring the toxicity and the retinol esters would be very helpful for the carnivore diet.
Yeah. I just think that there are much better sources of vitamin K than kale, and I want to highlight that for people. If you look at the Rotterdam study, which I talk about in the book, it's an epidemiology study that looked at over 4,000 people in Denmark, and incidence of cardiovascular disease was significantly associated in an inverse fashion, meaning that the more vitamin K2 people ate, the less cardiovascular disease they had. It was a very clear study, and the less aortic calcification they had. Now, interestingly, in the Rotterdam study and in many other studies with vitamin K, intake of vitamin K1 is not associated with any improvement in outcomes. So I have a real concern that we actually don't convert vitamin K1 to K2 very well. It may depend on our microbiome, and it may depend on our liver.
On your microbiome,
but
and it depends on your liver health.
I really do not recommend that people rely on vitamin K1 for vitamin K2 at all. I think that's not a good strategy. And I wonder I think there are much better ways to get vitamin K2. And if we're worried about vitamin A, that's fine. I've recommended people between 8 and 16 ounces of liver, so a little more than what you recommend. But there's, we know that animal fat has vitamin K2. We know that kidney
Paul,
has vitamin K2.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but what I'm trying to tell you is that in my own personal experience, the greens for the first 4 years, if my greens intake dropped, I felt terrible.
Interesting.
So within 24 hours, I could begin to not feel well. Within 36 hours, I was clearly not well. So whatever is going on, we don't know what it is. I'm theorizing it was partly the vitamin K2. But for me, the greens were clearly a huge part of my recovery.
Interesting.
I agree. The way we have changed farming practices so that our animals are no longer eating green grass, and so their vitamin K low. Their meat would be low. So if you're getting your organ meats from grain-fed animals that are housed inside, likely their vitamin K2 content of those animal products will be low. Whether or not we can efficiently make K2 from greens, we don't know. And we don't really know what was the healing part of those greens in my diet. But for the first 4 years of my recovery, if I didn't have that enormous intake of greens, I was ill.
Interesting. Yeah,
Now,
it's fascinating.
so I'm 12 years into my recovery. I can travel. I don't travel with those high intake of greens anymore. I travel with cabbage instead of greens. And also, you'll be pleased to know this, I travel with a bottle of organ meat capsules so I can keep up my organ meat. So I'm having my cabbage and my organ meat capsules, and now traveling is very easy and comfortable.
That's great. And those are something that I think are a great adjunct for people, the desiccated organs that can make traveling easier. But it's so interesting to look at where the nutrients are in animals. Listeners of this podcast will know that I'm a great advocate for nose to tail, and also that I strongly advocate and ask people to think about the quality of their food. I love that you highlighted this, and it sounded like when you had your improvement, you improved your food quality, specifically the quality of your animal foods. They went to more organic. You started eating more of the shellfish, or higher quality. And I think that I'm such an advocate for farms like Belcampo and White Oak Pastures, and I do think that if we are eating meat, or when we are eating meat, which we both agree is a vital part of the human diet, it makes so much sense to eat it from the best animals on the planet, both from an environmental perspective and from a nutritional perspective. Because if those cows are eating better food, they're just so much more likely to be nutrient rich for us. But I do think there may be something to vitamin K here, and I'm fascinated by that. And I wonder if it was just that you needed more vitamin K. And I just wanted to highlight that the vitamin K2 in animal foods is also quite robust.
Only if it's a grass-fed animal.
Right, exactly. From the best sourced animals.
Only if it's grass-fed animal or wild game or wild fish. If it's conventionally grown, I think that meat is a very different profile.
I do think that meat is inflammatory as well. I think it could be inflammatory, and I wonder about that. I've talked about that on a few podcasts in the past. My concerns that there could be bioaccumulation of atrazine, pesticides sprayed on the grains that are fed to that meat. Roundup, exactly.
And right now, even the hay is being sprayed with Roundup. So it's all to facilitate drying it more rapidly. So the amount of Roundup that's going into our animals that are grown conventionally is really quite enormous. And so their microbiome has changed.
Right.
And truly their nutritional quality of their meat, of all of the animal products from those animals, is radically different than the nutritional quality of a grass-fed, grass-finished animal.
I think so. And I don't know that we'll go down this rabbit hole on this podcast, but people may have heard me talk about just kind of the life cycle and the ethics of eating different types of animals. And people who listen will certainly know that I'm a great champion for regenerative agriculture and the percentage of organic matter in the soil. I think that is the single greatest metric that will determine the persistence of Homo sapiens on this planet. And regenerative agriculture is the clear way, which means rotational grazing, grass feeding, grass finishing in the real way that feeds the animals better, that will create health and disease. And I think that in the carnivore community, I fear this is being overlooked, and probably also within Paleolithic or other ancestral communities, that people are always worried about money and where they're going to spend their money. And I fear that people may not be thinking about the quality of their meat as much as they need to. I think it could be a completely different food.
Correct. Having said all of that, which I agree, I also acknowledge that in my lifestyle clinic, my patients were typically disabled, living on fixed income, living on food stamps. And so when they came to see us, we helped them figure out how to begin their diet and lifestyle journey within their financial constraints. So that would mean that people are starting out shopping in small town Iowa at the small rural grocery store where there is no organic food, and they might be getting frozen vegetables, canned vegetables, and meats. I'm getting them off sugar and processed food, so that's a big step in the right direction. And then I'd have some folks who were committed to the vegetarian diet for the religious reasons, or money was so tight that we were working with them on beans and rice, but we were using pressure cookers to make them the lectins less of a problem for them.
Right.
And so even though these folks were not doing the organic foods, regenerative foods that you and I would recommend, I was still achieving remarkable health transformations. Now, the other thing that, we'd work with these folks over 6 months. So in the beginning, they're doing their frozen vegetables, canned vegetables, and meats that they can afford. We're teaching them how to cook. And by the end of 6 months, Paul, very commonly, they're coming back and telling us that they've been figuring out how to get, more venison in their diet.
I love it.
How to get or the organic vegetables by going to the farmer's market and saying, at the end of the market here, what would you give me? What could I pay for the things that didn't sell? So they've gone from their conventional foods to organic foods, and they're still living on food stamps. And they've learned how to prioritize. So it is a journey. I want to acknowledge that I have an ideal recommendation where I want people to be ultimately with their food, but I'm going to take them from where they're at and work with them incrementally to steadily improve the quality of their diet, to improve their daily activities and their stress reduction.
I think that's amazing. I totally agree with that. So what does your diet look like right now?
Well, right now, so I'm in my 7-day water fast.
Okay.
So I have tea in my cup, and I do this 1 week out of every month. And then
wow, that's a lot of fasting. 1 week a month.
A lot of fasting.
Your water
1
fasting.
week a month. And I'll tell you, by day 6 or 7, you're pretty hungry. Actually, I'm quite hungry, and the intensity of my workouts are less.
Right.
By that far. Then I go to time restricted feeding, and I'm having again tea in the morning, water in the morning, and then an evening meal that will be some whatever the protein is. So a grass-fed meat. Once a week we have liver, and then I will make liver pate that I will have after the big liver and onions meals. And if you follow me on Instagram, you can see my typical meals. I will have my meat and vegetables. I'd say it's still many more vegetables than you're having. But well,
I don't have any, so yeah.
Yeah, so many more.
Infinitely more.
Correct. And again, everything's completely organic, and the meat's all regenerative. And I'm very attentive that I'm going to have liver once a week, and then we'll have liver pate for the next couple of meals after that day of liver. So I'm probably having liver. Well, we certainly have a lot of liver and organ meat.
That's great. What other organs do you eat?
Heart. We love heart. Kidney's quite good. Tongue is very good. And then, of course, bone broths, bone marrow, oysters, mussels, clams.
I love it. And I'll just highlight for the listener that heart is a pretty good source of riboflavin. Kidneys are a good source of riboflavin. Kidneys are much lower in vitamin A than the liver. So some mixing of kidney and liver in the diet probably makes a lot of sense. You can get lots of nutrients. Kidneys, in my opinion, are kind of like liver. They're pretty darn nutritious, and they don't have quite as much vitamin A if we're thinking in those terms. Do you have any concerns? Go ahead.
I've got some Brazilian recipes for lungs, but I've not been able to find any. The other thing that we have a lot of is chicken feet. So I will throw in chicken feet into our soups and stews. So that's a very common meal is stew meat with a variety of bones, mushrooms and onions and all of that.
Mushrooms are a whole complex topic that I have to do a whole nother podcast on. With kale, do you have any concerns about thallium in kale? I actually had someone that I met who had thallium toxicity from overeating kale.
Yeah, that is a interesting concern. I have not measured my thallium, so I can't comment on that.
What about, I think that the leafy greens are somewhere where we may disagree. With things like kale, I also worry about isothiocyanates and oxalates. Kale is not the highest in oxalates. Rhubarb would be much higher, sweet potatoes.
Yeah,
spinach is the worst one for oxalates. But with leafy, well, let's just talk about oxalates. Do you eat spinach? Do you have concerns about oxalates with leafy greens?
I'd say for the vast majority, oxalates will not be a problem. If you have autism spectrum disorder, more likely to be a problem. If you have kidney stones, more likely to be a problem. Now, this debate about plants, so I'll give you my ancestral health perspective and we can have a lovely debate here.
Sure.
Brunhilde is going to come out, the ancestral Germanic warrior princess kind of person from Northern Europe. Okay. So we'll go back a million years. I'm out there sort of hanging out with Neanderthals. And what are we eating? We're eating plants during the summer, along with our meat, in a variety of plants. During the winter, when the hunt is good, we're strictly carnivores. If the hunt's not good, now we're in ketosis, burning our fat and surviving. When summer comes along, we're still eating our meat. And Brunhilde's out there gathering some plants that mix in with the beet. And for the societies that I can find that are carnivores eating meat alone with no plants or minimal plants, the traditional societies that I'm aware of were eating their meat mostly raw and fermented. And certainly the meat was a very different product than what I see in the grocery store here. So my concerns are vitamin C. If you're in that we don't have that seasonal variation, that I'm much more comfortable if somebody is going to be a carnivore diet, that they fluctuate between carnivore and fasting. So we have that variation. And I'd rather that they have some seasonal introduction of some plant material to emulate what I think Brunhilde was doing. And I could be wrong, but even my Arctic friends, the Inuit, would have had plant materials seasonally during the summer and very little plant material during the winter. So my preference, where I have the most comfort, is when I can find a ancestral eating pattern to emulate.
And I think that's totally.
What have you found? Have you found any additional info?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's what the whole book is about, I guess. So.
Well, I'm going to look forward to reading that.
Yeah. I'm sending you a copy.
Your perspective.
Sending you a copy. Absolutely. So there's a lot of pieces there that I can offer, sort of my perspective on. A million years ago, we weren't really even Homo sapiens. We were probably Homo erectus and Homo habilis. Yes. From what I've read, it appears that Neanderthals broke off from Homo habilis maybe 600,000 years ago, et cetera. So somewhere in that range, I think. I'm not sure that we were in Northern Africa a million years ago or where we were, but I think there's this interesting question of how much did plants become survival food versus serving a unique, indispensable role in the human diet? And ultimately, I don't think we'll ever be able to construct or reconstruct the diet of our ancestors with incredible accuracy. But there are a few studies that I talk about in the book looking at stable isotopes from Neanderthals and Homo sapiens 40 to 50,000 years ago, so much more recently, and further back looking at stable isotope levels in the teeth of Homo habilis Paranthropus, which is a species that appears to have gone extinct, and Australopithecus, which preceded all of this probably 3 to 4 million years ago. And looking at the tooth stable isotope study, they can compare, and again, this is the best we can reconstruct it, they can compare strontium and calcium and barium ratios. And what appears to have happened, or at least the best reconstruction we have, is that we went from a species like Australopithecus that was eating a mix of plants and animals to perhaps a diversion or a separation into Paranthropus, which ate more plants, and Homo habilis, which ate more animals. And Paranthropus went extinct. And then it appears, looking at teeth, which again is an imperfect measure, that Homo habilis was eating a lot of animals. Now, that's not to say that Homo habilis wasn't eating any plants, but I think that the premise or the hypothesis that I advance in the book is, what if plants have just traditionally, evolutionarily been fallback foods, survival foods? Yeah. And the corollary question with that is, do plants provide any nutrients for humans that we cannot obtain from animals? And I'll speak to that a little bit, but that's the question. You know, if we were always able to have successful hunts, and we can also think about this in terms of megafauna, and we know that in the last 40 to 50,000 years, megafauna have gone extinct on all continents. So for the majority of our evolution, we may have been able to hunt much bigger, much fattier animals that were much more calorically, they had a much better caloric return on our energy investment to hunt them, rather than smaller animals like deer, etc. If we could get those animals, do plants serve a vital role in the human diet or not? Because the only reason we would ask this question is, do plants have toxins? And I think that we all agree that they have some toxins.
They all have a mix of toxins.
Yeah, they all have some toxins. And then we get into these interesting conversations about how much humans can detoxify them. Is there some genetic variation? If plants appeared to be completely benign, then, you know, including them in the diet wouldn't really be a conversation. But one of the interesting suggestions of a carnivore diet is that when some people eliminate some plants or all plants, autoimmune issues appear to get better. And so, do plants serve a unique, indispensable role in the human diet? How much a part of our diet were they evolutionarily? Was that a specific role, or was it as a fallback food? And so that's kind of how I frame it. And then if we look at the studies of Neanderthals and contemporary humans 40 to 50,000 years ago, we see the same sort of pattern, looking at D15 nitrogen levels or delta 15 nitrogen levels in the bones, suggesting that those humans and Neanderthals were eating a whole heck of a lot of animals, like even more than, they were eating larger animals, and they had higher levels of delta 15 nitrogen than known carnivores like hyenas. And so it's just an interesting question, like, do we need plants? And then I'll talk about the vitamin C, because that I think is a good segue. So when we're thinking about this, if we look at animal foods, and this is something that's so fascinating, I'd love to get your take on this. When we are eating animals nose to tail, it really appears that humans can get every single nutrient, every single vitamin, mineral that we need to thrive. And the common question is, what about vitamin C? And the interesting response is that there is vitamin C in animal foods. As you suggest, if the animal foods are fresh,
if you eat them raw, yes.
Or even just not overcooked.
Eat them raw.
Yeah, there's
them raw.
Well, I do eat raw liver. Anyone that listens to me will know that. Yeah. So there's plenty of, there is vitamin C in animal foods. And then there's interesting conversations that I've had with Chris Masterjohn and James DiNicolantonio is, what is ideal? There certainly is good evidence that there's enough vitamin C in animal foods to prevent scurvy. There's studies from conscientious objectors from 1940 that say 10 milligrams of vitamin C a day is enough to prevent scurvy. But then we move further and we say, what is ideal for vitamin C in the human body? And I think that's where we start to wonder. There are a couple of studies I've talked about where the fruit and vegetable intake was increased in someone's diet, and their vitamin C intake went from 70 to 270 milligrams a day. And despite increased blood levels of vitamin C, there was no change in antioxidant parameters, DNA damage, et cetera. So, and then if you look at interventional studies with vitamin C, they generally fail to show improvements in endpoints of cardiovascular disease, common cold, cancers, et cetera. So I think it's an interesting question. What is the ideal amount of vitamin C for humans? We know we need it, but I'm not convinced that we need mega doses or doses that are not easily obtainable from reasonably fresh, not overcooked animal foods.
Now, if you look at some historical data, and you probably have done this, the Arctic expeditions had a very high mortality rate. However, when finally the first northern explorer who made it to the North Pole, instead of eating the European rations, just started eating the way the Inuit guides ate, and were eating raw meat. And the raw rations from the Inuit, they survived and actually put on weight. And I believe he came back and continued with his raw meat diet, or at least some of the travelers did. And I think that's, to me, a compelling way that at least when I'm talking to people who are interested in the carnivore diet, is I let them know that the evidence that I'm aware of is that following the traditional patterns of the Inuit, people did very, very well with these raw meat foods and fermented foods, but they still had some seasonal exposure to plants. And what we do know historically is that we can survive on a meat-only diet. We can survive. It'd be difficult. It's going to be difficult to survive only on plants. It's going to be difficult to survive only on in a ketogenic diet. But apparently, we can digest these foods, and the fact that we're able to digest these foods have added to our apparently our survival resilience. What is the correct role in the ratio for what these plants are? Is probably a fairly broad spectrum of what we can tolerate and what's optimal. When we try to design what's optimal, another factor for us to consider is the blue zone areas, where you have societies that live in high proportions to over 100, that have diets that may include foods that I don't care for, that I certainly am not going to recommend: dairy, gluten, that they still thrive and survive and flourish quite well. So which keeps me sort of humble as I go about this discovery that I'm on, which is, what is the most optimal diet? What is that spectrum? And how do I help people continue to move towards improving the quality of what they're doing, closer to a blue zone diet, closer to my diet, or perhaps closer to a carnivore diet that's respectful of their current development in their spiritual beliefs and their economic reality and the reality of their family.
Yeah, so I have a whole section in the book, in my book, The Carnivore Code, where I talk about the blue zones.
Oh,
and
great.
I've debated Stephen Gundry about this, and I would love to debate Dan Buettner. The blue zones, in my opinion, are nothing less than a fallacy. The blue zones are basically Ansel Keys cherry picking. And basically what Dan Buettner and his colleagues did was choose 5 regions of the world: the Icaria region of Greece, Sardinia, the Nicoya region of Costa Rica, Loma Linda, California, and Okinawa. And they tried to extrapolate what their diet was and say, and they also looked at lifestyle, and they tried to say, hey, these places have exceptional longevity. The problem with any of these type of constructs is that they're cherry picked, right? There are many regions of the world, Hong Kong, Iceland, where there is also a higher than average proportion of centenarians and super centenarians who eat diets that are nothing like the blue zones, quote unquote, diets. Furthermore, and I talk about this in detail in the book, if you look at the diets of any one of those places except Loma Linda, they actually eat a pretty substantial amount of meat. So this is this is pretty much exactly like Ansel Keys going around the world with his 7 countries study during Lent, when they weren't eating meat, and saying these places don't eat meat, and then saying, and these places fit the model that meat or saturated fat increases cholesterol, and that leads to heart disease. And so I think that Dan Buettner has done us a real disservice here. If you look at Okinawa specifically, Okinawa is not Buddhist. And so there has been no taboo on meat. And the Okinawans eat more meat than the general Japanese population. They love pork, and they eat it, with fervor. Sardinia, they have a whole dish that's called sarda pig, which is a pastured pig. And if you look at the feast, people can just look up Sardinian meat or sarda pig, Sarda. Feasts of meat in Sardinia are very common. In Nicoya region of Costa Rica, it's only a longevity region for the men. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If men and women are eating the same thing, why would that happen? But in the Nicoya region of Costa Rica, they are known to eat more meat and to cook more of their meat and foods in animal fat than the general Costa Rican population, who they outlive. If we look at Icaria and Greece, it's the exact same story. They treasure meat. None of these places are plant-based. And then the last one is Loma Linda. Well, I talk about this specifically in the book, and I've mentioned it on my Instagram as well. Loma Linda is a place where there are Seventh-day Adventists, and the Seventh-day Adventist culture is to discourage people from eating meat. About half the people in Loma Linda are lacto-ovo vegetarians, and a smaller proportion are vegans. And people point to Loma Linda, and this actually happened on the recent episode of The Doctors that I was on. I want to talk about that with you as well before we wrap up. One of the, they didn't put this in the clip because this made them look bad, but one of the doctors said, "What about Loma Linda? What about the blue zones?" And I said, you know what? The people in Loma Linda live an average of 7 years longer than those in California. The Loma Linda's in Southern California. But if you look at Mormons living in California, they also live 7 years longer than the average Californian. And Mormons don't shun meat. They eat steak, in the same way.
Yeah.
What do both of those people do? They don't drink, they don't smoke, and they focus on family. And so when people hold up Loma Linda as a blue zone, I bristle and I think that's inaccurate. Well, you can't say that with the epidemiology.
It's certainly true. Even the complexity of what Buettner advocates in his blue zone is that it's more than the diet. There is the social construct,
totally agree.
And the physical activity. And so diet and lifestyle is a very complex conversation. I think where we have tremendous agreement is that our current epidemic of autoimmune issues and poor health is because we have this profound mismatch between our environment that we have created culturally and through all of our innovations that is more and more comfortable. And the food is more and more processed and designed away from real food, the worse our health becomes. And that meat is certainly a critical part of a healthy diet. That plant material has some role. We don't know what role for that. That, at least in my case, plants and meat were a critical part of my recovery. Mm-hmm. And if I reduced the plant intake early in my recovery, my health sharply declined. And so, and there may well be a genetic variation that determines what tolerance we have and which of these diets is most beneficial.
Yeah, and I definitely
but clearly the conventional diet and lifestyle, there's a profound mismatch that is exploding our health crisis that none of the politicians are discussing. So whether they're a Republican or Democratic, they're not discussing that the root cause of our health problem is this mismatch. And it doesn't matter how much money we spend on healthcare, we won't become healthy if we never address this core mismatch.
I totally agree. Well said. And the other problem, in my opinion, is that Western medicine doesn't realize this either, that we're not taught this in medical schools. Imagine if in medical school we were taught, here are all the drugs that you're going to see used, but you know what? The biggest lever is food. So figure out what food works best for your patients. And here are some of the diets that work for people. Here's the Wahls diet. Here's this diet. Here's paleo diet. Here's a carnivore diet. These are the diets that work. And this is the research on these diets. And imagine if that were taught in medical school, that would be groundbreaking.
If we taught people to ask, do you cook meals at home using ingredients as opposed to boxes and processed foods?
Yeah.
And imagine if you started having a cooking class that you help sponsored in your local religious communities or your local YMCA or the public school or the library. This is the profound impact that could radically improve the health of your tribe, your community. And that's what we did in our lifestyle clinic at the VA.
Oh yeah, you guys did amazing things.
We had cooking classes, we had meditation classes, we had movement classes. And I got to, every 3 months report to my hospital director and the chief of staff what we were doing. And because the VA had an electronic medical record, we could get these reports that would show the improvements in blood pressure, in A1C, in the reduction in medication use, the reduction in hospitalization. It was stunning. I mean, there was no fancy testing. There was no fancy supplements. All I had was inspiration, teaching people the possibility of hope, asking if they knew how to cook, having them come to cooking classes, having them come to our other skills classes. And my patients were people living on food stamps. So when people say, only the wealthy folks can do this, my folks were not wealthy.
Like, I love it. Absolutely. And I love that you use the word radical. That's like my favorite word.
Yes, this radical notion that teaching your patients to cook is the most fundamental skill that you can give people, and teaching them to cook with ingredients. Teaching them, organic liver is very cheap. That's easy to find. In Iowa, many communities have venison because they have controlled kills to control the deer population. Perfect. So venison's in the meat locker, free for anyone who wants it.
Wow.
And so it is accessible. In Iowa, it's easy. There's plenty of deer, plenty of hunters who are shooting deer and are willing to share in that meat. So this can be much more affordable than people realize. And teaching people to get a pressure cooker and to get the inexpensive stew cuts of meats, the bones, and to make their soups and stews very inexpensive. It makes this so much more affordable. Because I certainly, in my population, money was tough, and I had to be very sensitive to that.
Yeah. And so just to wrap up the Blue Zones conversation for people, and then we'll move on to one more question I have for you, and then we'll wrap it up. It seems that I'm not debating that there are regions of the world where people live longer. I think that what I suspect is that it's more to do with the community and the lifestyle than individual dietary variations, because we see people eating a variety of foods. Hong Kong, for instance, in Hong Kong, the life expectancy is 85 years, and they are the third largest consumer of beef in the world. They eat 1.5 pounds of meat a day. So for people to suggest that the absence of meat is associated with longevity doesn't hold up, in my opinion. And then I'll just add the one more thing about Loma Linda. I've talked about this before, is that when we look at sperm quality of males in Loma Linda, it's abysmal. They have hypomotility, so slow motility, and the sperm counts are lower. And the sperm counts of vegetarians are worse than omnivores, and the sperm counts of vegans in Loma Linda are worse than vegetarians. And so it's a real, in my opinion, indictment into the potential problems with that sort of thing. And there's other studies that have been done, actually at Harvard. I talk about both of these in my book, that correlated more fruits and vegetables in the diet with worse sperm quality. And this it's unclear whether this has to do with problems, whether in Loma Linda, I suspect it's due to nutrient inadequacy in those peoples. In the Harvard study, they hypothesize it's due to pesticides or residues on the vegetables, and that eating more traditional vegetables is lowering, but it's clear, there's a clear association in both of those studies between more fruits and vegetables and lower sperm quality. So pretty striking.
Well, globally, we can debate the fact that sperm counts have been falling.
Yeah, it's scary.
Globally, and that menarche is younger and younger for women, and that fertility rates are falling globally as well. So I think that's a separate debate that would be very interesting for us to look at. What are the public health implications and the economic implications of the fact that fertility rates are plummeting? I'll also make the pitch that we have many folks who've had infertility either from the male line or the female line, who, when they've embraced my program, are now successfully parenting and having children, and getting pregnant. And so absolutely, diet quality, lifestyle has a huge impact on whether or not you're going to have a pregnancy. And if you do get pregnant, be able to carry that pregnancy to term and have a full term baby come out as opposed to a premature infant.
Yeah, I love
These are
that.
huge, huge public health issues. And again, tremendous economic burden where the health policy makers don't understand the root cause of these problems, our diet and lifestyle.
Yeah, I love it. And it's interesting. I think that when we see insulin resistance improve, we see fertility improve. And when we take out processed foods, we see fertility improve, and see that in the carnivore community as well. And it's probably one of the coolest things because the people who are making those determined lifestyle choices, those intentional lifestyle choices are going to raise healthy children, and those children are going to be in families where they're going to get a lot of support. So it's fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I just want to make sure that we covered this because I know my listeners are going to be super interested. Any other concerns that you have about a carnivore diet that I could speak to or that we could talk about, and then we can wrap it up? Thanks so much.
Well, so vitamin C.
So we talked about that one.
We talked about that. Vitamin A, we've talked about that. And then the other thing that I raise is the information that I can find is that the carnivore diet is not, the meat only intake is not year round indefinitely. For the societies that I can find, and I look forward to your book, so I will perhaps find more societies, is that the meat or animal product only is for a large part of the year, and then part of the year there's introduction of plant materials.
Sure. Yeah, and anthropologically, I think we see that pattern frequently. Do you have any thoughts about what those plant materials, do you think those plant materials may have a unique role, or what are your thoughts about not having that seasonal variation? How could that be problematic?
So I think it may have to do with my thinking on the benefits of ketosis. I mean, I love ketosis. There are so many reasons to think that ketosis is just tremendously good for you. But it turns out that there's a cost with ketosis, that if I'm in ketosis, I'm getting a lot of signals to put myself in a little hibernation state. Thyroid goes down, sex hormones go down, fertility declines. And over time, my brain's going to suffer from the lower thyroid levels and the lower hormone levels. So I'm more inclined to think in terms of hormesis now, and prefer that my ketosis be intermittent. And I prefer that my patient's ketosis is intermittent. Therefore, again, in my simplistic way of thinking about things, what Brunhilde might have been doing, thousands of generations ago, that was there some important advantage, reproductive advantage that she got because she had plants intermittently? I don't know.
As a source of carbohydrates?
As a source of, I don't know.
Right.
That it was part of her diet, and she had reproductive success. And in nature, it seems to me that the random mutations that occur that take advantage of the environment that you live in, that when those random mutations are helpful, you have reproductive success. And so you keep getting more finely tuned to the environment that you're living in through those random mutations. So the fact that Brunhilde may have had plenty of big animals to chew on much of the time, sometimes was chewing on plants that she got as part of her gathering, sometimes chewing on small animals, salamanders, snakes, whatever, eggs seasonally, that she developed random mutations that made those advantageous. So, and I have no idea what those would be, and I don't know that my other PhD colleagues would know necessarily what those advantages would be. But it's my expectation that there are random mutations that occurred in Brunhilde that I probably have. That would mean that, yes, I could probably do better. Perhaps I could do better on with more meat, less plants. I'm not convinced yet that long-term for the rest of my life, the absence of plants would be an advantage. I might be able to tolerate it and do fine. But I think the Brunhildes probably had plants at least seasonally.
Sometimes, yeah. It's interesting. So I did a whole conversation about this with Chris Masterjohn that I would refer people to regarding ketosis. That was the second friendly debate I did with Chris Masterjohn. I think that the first part of this equation, as I see it, is that there's clear benefits to being in ketosis from time to time. I think we agree on that.
Mm-hmm.
I did a whole podcast with James Clement about mTOR and IGF-1, and I think that we definitely need periods of fasting and or time restricted feeding and or low carbohydrate eating.
We need ketosis.
Yeah, we need ketosis. And
we need ketosis. It's really,
you know, what's quite interesting is that many people can eat carbohydrates and still have ketosis at certain times of the day. If we're not eating excessive carbohydrates all the time, if we're doing any sort of time restricted eating, we are certainly going to have ketones in our body from time to time. And I talked about this with James Clement, that if we wake up in the morning and we have fasting levels of ketones that are positive, and I don't think we really know whether the cutoff is 0.5 millimolar or 0.2 millimolar or whatever, there's probably autophagy happening in our liver and throughout our body at some level, and IGF-1 levels are low. And what's interesting for me, and I talk about this with Chris Masterjohn, is that a carnivore diet is quite fascinating because you can still remain, well, there are a couple of nuances here. On a carnivore diet that provides adequate amounts of protein, which I would think of as 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, we are not necessarily always in ketosis. We know that we can do gluconeogenesis. We know that when we give our body enough protein, we can move out of ketogenic physiology. So that's kind of interesting, that even without formal carbohydrates, we can move out of ketosis if we give ourselves enough protein. So that's one permutation of a carnivore diet. The other notion that I think is fascinating is that we can get carbohydrates without eating plant matter. Honey, for people that tolerate dairy. Liver actually has some carbohydrates because it has glycogen. So that's fascinating. And then I think you're absolutely right. I think we need to watch these things and watch our hormones. And if they start to tank or we start to feel badly, I have no problem with the reintroduction of carbohydrates in a pulsatile fashion or for longer amounts of time with some intermittent ketosis, if we consider those carbohydrates on a spectrum of plant toxicity, and I talk about this in the book, if we're going to eat carbohydrates, which carbohydrates are least toxic for humans, right? I would think of some carbohydrates as potentially more triggering to the immune system. So it's quite a fascinating conversation. I think we need to signal to our body both feast and famine. And I talked about this with Chris Masterjohn. If we're getting enough protein and enough calories, can that provide a fed state signal to humans in the absence of carbohydrates? It's an interesting conversation.
I certainly agree. We will do best if we experience that hormetic effect of fed and not fed, so that we have that mild to moderate stress, and then have a feeding recovery period. And that's certainly what the dietary pattern that I'm choosing. And so far it's working out very well.
No, it's great. It's amazing. I think that we're on the same page there. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so, it'll be interesting to try and get some clinical studies to see what the effect of the carnivore diet would be prospectively.
Yeah. There's one that I've mentioned in the past. There was a very close follow of 2 people that came back from Alaska, specifically Villimer Stephenson and Anderson in 1930, that was done at Bellevue Hospital. Sometimes people poo-poo that study saying it was 1930, but they looked at kidney function, they looked at weight, so that we actually—
Still be very useful, yeah.
Yeah, we do. We do have some interesting data. And I talked about a study a few weeks ago with Chris Kresser, that there was actually a week-long study done at Harvard looking at the carnivore diet and the microbiome. So, but we're hoping, I think that's the next project, is once I get the book out, that we're going to do some clinical studies.
So if you can find some funding, we'll be happy to run them for you.
Let's do it.
Yeah, it gets funny. The challenge is that these are doing clinical trials are expensive, but certainly what I've found is when I put that out there, I want to run these trials, we have been successful at finding donors who are interested in supporting a study. So what would be most ideal would be a single-arm feasibility study for safety in a target population to see what the effect is. And since my target population is MS, we should talk if you can find some funding for us. Yeah. I'd love to do a little study for you to answer some of these questions.
I think it's amazing. People are getting excited listening to this right now. I think we could even crowdsource it. Yeah, offline, we'll talk about how much money we might need to fund it. But you guys listening to this podcast, we're going to get a crowdfunding. We're going to get a GoFundMe. We're going to fund this study.
Let's do it. I mean, I think it'd be really very interesting. We have a lot of experience doing dietary intervention studies. And so if we put out, a small study of 20 folks, we could have some parameters that we could follow and see if it's sustainable, what the effect is on the diet. And depending on the money that we can collect, that would depend on how many things I can measure and assess, and how long we could run this. It could be, yeah, let's do it. Well, let's talk offline and figure out how to help raise the money to get a little pilot going.
You guys heard it here first. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You've got the second edition of the Wahls protocol. You've got the second edition of the book coming out March 17th.
Yes.
Where can people find more of your work, and how do they get all of your stuff?
Yeah, go to terrywahls.com, Terry, Wahls, WAHLS.com. If you do add /research papers, then you get access to all of our research papers, including the video of these remarkable changes in gait that we're able to achieve. So that would be fabulous. And then you can learn more about our in-person event and certification programs at terrywahls.com.
Awesome. And I hope that you and I can share a steak soon.
Oh my God. Why steak? Come on. What's wrong with liver, man?
I'll eat some liver with you anytime.
Yeah, lamb liver is perfect. That's
perfect.
The perfect meal.
That's so on brand for me. So the last question I always ask my podcast guests is, and I'm super excited for your answer on this, is what is the most radical thing that you have done recently? And this is, this is like awesome radical. It's like 80s radical.
Well, I love doing electrical stimulation of muscles to get more intense workout. And so I've added now a spa foot bath. So I put the electrodes in the water, put my feet in the water, more electrodes on my belly, dial up the current. So my spouse was like, "Oh my God, is this okay?" I keep dialing up the current. And it is an amazing feeling, this electrified body. So I've added that to my daily routine now, this electrified body.
That's amazing. So when we eat liver, you have to show me how you do that, and I want to do that too.
Yes, it'd be a lovely dinner.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Much love to you.
All right, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, cavemen and cavewomen. That was a fun one with Terry Wahls. It was super interesting to hear about her story for me and to try and dig into what was the difference for her. I kind of want to have her back on and dig more into this. What I took away from this was her perspective that she does feel that a low-fat vegetarian diet might have prompted her autoimmune disease. And what aspect of that might have been most triggering to her is interesting. I think that most people will be aware that plants can trigger the immune system. Now, which plants are triggering the immune system in which people is fascinating. And it might have also been nutrient deficiency in her case, with a low-fat vegetarian diet being probably pretty nutrient deficient and certainly vitamin K deficient. Vitamin K came up a lot in this podcast, and we talked a lot about how problematic it could be to not get animal sources of vitamin K. I do think that many people are not going to be able to convert K1 from leafy greens into K2, as I talked about in the podcast. The Rotterdam study suggests that strongly, and I think we should be getting vitamin K from animals. I talk all about this in the book, which is out February 25th, thecarnivorecodebook.com. Dr. Wahls has made such great contributions. I'm so excited to potentially collaborate with her on a study in the future. We certainly disagree about the utility of leafy greens in the human diet. One of the things that I would mention is that I think of these as probably some of the worst things that we can eat from a plant toxicity standpoint, but it's working for Dr. Wahls, so we have to study it. We have to think about it. It's also interesting to note that she is eating meat and she's sourcing very well and she's eating organ meats. And really, a lot of what was happening with her was the inclusion of meat and organ meats in her diet that was so valuable. So super interesting podcast, you guys. Stay ready for the book, February 25th, thecarnivorecodebook.com. Leave me a review on iTunes if you like this podcast. I love doing it. And you know what? It allows me to share these conversations, which I hope are valuable for all of you. And it lets me do my own radical thing and stay radical. Speaking of which, I've got a radical t-shirt. It's on my website under media. You can go to merchandise. And if you get the t-shirt and tag me on Instagram, I will repost it because I am so stoked that you are part of the tribe. You guys are all part of the tribe, whether you have the t-shirt or not, but you know what I mean. And I can't wait to see some people in the t-shirt at some of the conferences that I am going to in this year. So check out my website, carnivoremd.com. You can sign up for the newsletter there, which is the Fundamental Health Insider. It comes out on Sundays. It went out this past weekend. So if you are not signed up, you missed the boat. But you can get the next boat, which will be happening frequently. There are lots of boats this time of year because the book is coming out. So I'm super excited to share all of that information with you guys. CarnivoreMD.com. Sign up for the newsletter. Check out my stuff on Amazon, thecarnivorecodebook.com. I love and appreciate you guys all so much. Let me know how I can do better, and let me know what you want to hear about. Let me know who you want to have on the podcast. Let me know what you like. Let me know what you don't like, and stay radical.